Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Strichen, Aberdeenshire in Scotland, where we today mark the first report card of the new Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Because of the COVID crisis, Starmer became Labour leader without the normal fanfare of a leadership election, and his first 2 months in leadership has been totally within the context of social distancing and the pandemic crisis. Our two examiners today are political commentators Steve Richards and Professor Richard Murphy. When we spoke to them back in February, both tipped then runaway favourite Keir Starmer for victory, but both laid down these markers for the future.
They see in him a weighty, credible, authoritative figure who might, no one can tell in advance, who might be the leaderly figure to lead them towards some kind of recovery.
If Johnson is a disaster, the question is Keir Starmer the man who could replace him? If Johnson is a success, it doesn't matter what Keir Starmer does because Johnson is going to be in power for 10 years. So the question is, can he actually nail Johnson down?
That remark from Richard Murphy looks particularly percipient given the weekend collapse in the opinion polls for the government and the aftermath of the Dominic Cummings shambles. However, how is Keir Starmer performing himself? Is he living up to the early expectations of the leadership? Find out later in the programme. But now to Tasmina in Glasgow. Your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex. And some interesting responses to our show last week on Whatever Happened to Brexit, featuring MP Daniel Kowczynski, Roger Casale and MSP Alex Neil. John Stoddart says, England and Wales voted for Brexit. Scotland and Northern Ireland didn't. So the claim that the British people voted for it is bogus. Scott Hutton says, truth be told, Britain's exit from the EU has left a vacuum that no one has the power to repair. The loss of identity for each trading party within the bloc has revealed itself, and it is of concern to the EU that each country will now blaze a trail for themselves rather than use the EU as a launching platform for trade. James says, informative show, thank you. The COVID-19 Brexit double whammy compelling a degree of realism on both sides. David Richardson says, Scotland's future is as a full member, playing a full part as an independent nation within the EU. Maureen says, God bless all our people. Brexit's going to be bad, and yet we voted to stay. Richard Flanagan says, a train crash waiting to happen. Same confusion as the COVID crises. Politicians misleading the masses. Fog on the channel, continent isolated. But don't worry, Boris and Donald will survive. And then John Gourley says, I agree with Mr Alec Neil that both sides need a deal, but this overhaul of businesses may look a lot easier without any Brexit complications at all. A no-deal Brexit may suit the EU now and put the UK in its proper place more quickly. Brian Nolan Hambley says, Govan Gang's still on track for the no-deal outcome and prepping the masses for an EU bad result. And finally, Alan James Reid messages us all the way from New Zealand, sending his greetings. Well, greetings back to you, Alan. Stay safe and keep watching.
Now, few people have studied the art of political leadership more avidly than Steve Richards, the political commentator. Steve Richards now joins me to assess these early days of Sir Keir Starmer. So, Steve Richards, how's Sir Keir Starmer doing thus far?
I think he's doing pretty well. When you're elected leader of the opposition in the midst of a pandemic, there's a real danger that you are perceived as being wholly marginal from the crisis. You have no power. All you have are words, and words are pretty hopeless in the context of a pandemic. But he's made himself relevant by his scrutiny of the government, which had got away really with very little scrutiny before he got the job, and that has been highly effective. And second, and this is not to be underestimated in the context of the UK Labour Party, he's taken control of its machinery quite early on. And for a leader to have control of that machinery, appointing his chosen general secretary of the party, for example, gives him quite a lot of leeway. So in quite difficult circumstances, he's made a significant start.
But in a sense, these difficult circumstances have actually played into Keir Starmer's style, which is forensic and understated, perhaps rather suitable to Prime Minister's questions in the in the virtual social distancing age?
The House of Commons at Prime Minister's questions has been closer to the courtroom he is familiar with, the former Director of Public Prosecutions. What is untested is whether he will be as effective when the House of Commons is at its rowdiest, when you have to think very quickly, when wit can be a very powerful weapon. He hasn't had to use any of that. He's played to his strengths, which is, of course, forensic questioning. He's done it throughout his entire career. So there are still huge, huge tests to come. And as you say, in a way that wouldn't have always been the case with everybody, this pandemic and the consequences have actually played to his strengths.
I've been having a glance at Keir Starmer's Twitter feed, and it is very safe and very disciplined. Not much chance of Twitter fact-checking Keir Starmer, I don't think. But is that sort of disciplined approach, is that going to be enough for a leader of the opposition once we get through this pandemic and people are going to be looking for a bit of inspiration?
No, it's by no means enough. I think the calculation for the moment is that the government is in obvious difficulty on many different fronts, and it's best to just let the government play out some of these difficulties. At some points in the cycle, a leader of the opposition must start stirring things, must start to rouse the passion of the electorate as well as its sort of distant admiration. And so it won't be enough. I can understand early on why caution is the driving force. But if it remains the case that electoral mountain will not be climbed, there will have to be moments of great political courage in the years and months to come if he has to have a hope of winning this election whenever it comes later.
Now, Steve Richards, you're famed for your portraits of prime ministers and leaders of the opposition from the past. There have been two Labour leaders in the last half-century or so who've overturned large Conservative majorities, Harold Wilson and Tony Blair. How would Sir Keir Starmer at this stage compare to the approach to leadership of that duo?
Well, he has displayed a degree of wiliness that both Blair and Wilson had in common. He hasn't yet displayed the wit and flair that both of them, also in their early years in opposition, had in common. Starmer has quite a job in keeping his Labour Party united. He has said that Wilson is his model in that respect. But in terms of flair and wit and verve and mischievousness, we still haven't seen those characteristics in Keir Starmer yet.
Now, for better or worse, both Harold Wilson and Tony Blair could be said as opposition leaders to catch the mood of the times. In a post-COVID environment, it's going to require some fundamental reassessment to catch the mood in that situation. Is that the sort of thing that Keir Starmer is likely to be able to grasp and to run with?
This will be his biggest test because suddenly we're in a world where the state is seen as a benevolent force. But what follows the pandemic in terms of economic policy and the role of the state, I think will be Starmer's big calls. How much he disagrees with the government, who might retain some of this statism in the years that follow, and the degree to which he pushes for an even greater statist approach, that's going to be a huge call because it shapes everything. It shapes how much you're going to have to raise in taxation, how much you plan to spend, how you plan to tax, and then you have to frame arguments that win elections with these policies. So unquestionably, the post-pandemic economic debate will be the one, I think, that decides in the end the fate of Keir Starmer more than anything else.
Now, the Tory press, the right-wing media, have been pretty quiet on Starmer thus far, presumably because of the COVID crisis and the atmosphere that we've been working under politically. But the attack presumably will come. When it does come, what direction do you think it will take?
What they can't do, which is what they usually do with a Labour leader, is say you can't trust this figure, he's inexperienced, he will not know what to do if he got into government, or she, it's always a he with Labour. You can't do that with someone who rose to the very top as Director of Public Prosecutions. You can go for some of the things he decided to do then, but you can't make that attack that here is someone incapable of government, not to be trusted with government, which is a familiar attack. So I think they will go for him in that way, but I think it's very interesting. Even in these early days, he has at least attempted to form some kind of, how should I put it, flirtatious relationship with some of the more doting Tory-supporting papers.
And how will Keir Starmer approach the European issue? I mean, by background, by inclination, much more positive towards the European Union, much more of a pro-European than Jeremy Corbyn, but has been pretty quiet on issues like extension of the transitional period and things like that. Will he regard Europe as a hot potato that he's going to have to handle very carefully?
Yes, I think he does. We know that he's a pro-European. We know that he thinks Brexit is a disaster because he has opposed it and said so. He doesn't believe a significant trade deal can be negotiated in a year. He thinks it is impossible, just purely from a practical point of view, to do it. So he will say, look, the government say they can, let's see. And when it transpires that either they can't or it's utterly threadbare, I think then he might find the space to challenge and attack it. But he's going to be very, very cautious because he knows he can't win an election unless he gets some of those seats back that he lost, that Labour lost in the December election. But he, compared to other opposition parties who are already saying, what's the government doing? There should be an extension. You're right. He's being absolutely cautious and hasn't uttered a word to that effect yet.
Now, some encouraging signs for Keir Starmer in the UK polls, with both the Labour Party ratings improving and his own personal ratings overtaking Boris Johnson. But not much sign that he's cutting any ice in Scotland. How will Keir Starmer tackle the Scottish issue?
Keir Starmer knows he has got to make inroads in Scotland. I don't think he knows yet quite how he's going to do it. It remains, in a way, more than Brexit, as you know better than anyone, the most fundamental shift in British politics since the independence referendum has been the rise of the SNP and the collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland. It surprised Ed Miliband the degree to which it happened. Corbyn failed totally in his early hopes that he could turn that round. And I think Starmer knows he's got to do it, but is not sure how. As you know, Jeremy Corbyn and his allies were hinting that there could well be a referendum and you would see what will happen on independence. I think he will oppose that route and be more strongly identified unequivocally with the defence of the Union. Beyond that, and he'll have thoughts about the Scottish Labour Party, but I don't think they are fully developed, and I don't think he has remotely yet thought through the messaging that will be effective in Scotland.
Steve Richards, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alex.
Now, coming up after the break, I'll be joined by political commentator Professor Richard Murphy, who'll look at some of the key policy challenges facing the new Labour leader. Welcome back. Now, everything Sir Keir Starmer has said thus far as leader of the opposition, for very understandable reasons, has been dominated by the COVID crisis. But ultimately, it's his approach to policy issues such as Europe and, above all, the economy in the post-pandemic era that will determine his success or failure as Labour leader. To assess these prospects, I turn to Professor Richard Murphy, who joins me from Cambridgeshire. Richard Murphy, in terms of how the pandemic has impacted on people's attitude, I know that your family have had your own personal experience, as have so many others. Could you tell us a bit about that and how that's impacted perhaps in your attitude to general affairs?
Well, I am quite certain I've had coronavirus. I mean, I didn't have a test because they just weren't available. And my son, who actually went to Italy in February on a university trip, came back with what was, in retrospect, glaringly, obviously coronavirus, even though he wasn't in the sealed off area at that time. Indeed, I went to see him. I was so worried about his health, and almost certainly he gave it to me. We're both fully recovered now. The reality is that for most people, compliance with lockdown is going to last for a lot longer. We have a lot more distance to go before we return to something that looks like 2019 again, in my opinion.
Well, Richard, we're very glad to have you back fit and commenting on this programme. When I asked you during the leadership race, you said a lot of what Sir Keir Starmer does will depend on how Boris Johnson was performing as Prime Minister. How right you were.
Indeed. Look, Boris Johnson has performed abysmally, in my opinion, as Prime Minister. And I don't think I'm alone. Clearly, he's suffered recent record falls in popularity for any leader in a week. So Keir Starmer has been given a blessing in the form of Boris Johnson's performance to date. And that's very confusing for what we're about to discuss, though, because it's meant that Keir Starmer has not had to define his own position. He has, probably wisely, just let Boris Johnson keep digging the hole he's already in.
And does the Dominic Cummings affair, does that point to something that's transitory, or does it suggest more fundamental weaknesses in the Conservative government structure, which Sir Keir Starmer will be able to exploit as opposition leader?
Both you and I have been around politics for quite a long time, Alex, and I equate this with the Black Wednesday era of John Major's government. There has been a catastrophic loss of confidence in the ability of the government, and Boris Johnson has reacted by supporting Dominic Cummings rather than taking the necessary step of getting rid of him. In that case, I see this as being a 4-year period of a lame duck government staggering towards an inevitable election where things are going to be very different from what we could have imagined last December. Very few people, only the optimists, thought that Labour had a chance of winning in 2024 when we looked at the last election result. The Dominic Cummings affair seems to have changed that completely. I think we're seeing a government that is already holed below the waterline and where we're just going to watch it sink steadily over the next few years.
But of course, the Conservative Party are still leading in the polls, albeit the gap is narrower. And of course, the guns of the Tory press haven't been turned on the Labour leader yet. Won't that sort of thing make a difference?
Well, let's be honest, Alex, we don't know. If we now see a situation where there are a great many further deaths from coronavirus, then I think we're going to see the Tory press holding this government to account. I don't rule out that would require a change of Tory leader even. I certainly can see there being an internal challenge to Boris Johnson in a way that was unimaginable last December. So many things are still to play for in this situation. Keir Starmer's job right now is to let it roll, to be blunt. And only when the pandemic comes towards a close, and epidemiologists tell me that will be by late this year, early next year, come what may, then he will have to lay out his real stall and people will need to know where he stands. But right now, he doesn't need to do that at all.
But when he does need to do that, when he has to lay out his stall, what is his approach going to be on the hot potato of Europe? And is Sir Keir Starmer the sort of person who's going to have the imagination to come up with policies for the post-pandemic era on the economy, which are going to be fundamental to success at the next election?
Everything that we know of has been put on hold, except apparently Brexit, where the transition period is not going to be extended. I'm still not entirely convinced that that is true. I think that there will come a point where panic will simply set in the government about the consequences of continuing to pursue Brexit without an extended transition because of the lack of preparation. And I am not convinced that we are going to finally break on the 31st December this year as a consequence. That doesn't mean to say we don't need a policy. Keir Starmer clearly does need a policy on Europe. What Keir Starmer's got to do is find a policy platform that lets him balance these risks whilst saying
he respects the result of the referendum because he can't do anything else about that now. He can't, for example, inside the Labour Party, reopen the risk of having that fight again. So really, he's laying the path towards eventual reconciliation with Europe. And I believe he would have the negotiating skills to do that.
And on the economy, it could be argued that in a post-pandemic atmosphere that the sort of economic measures required to get us through the crisis and then after the crisis are rather more suitable to the Labour Party, to a left-of-centre party, than to the Tory party. But equally, there'll be a lot of imagination required on new economic policy. Is the Labour Party in a position as yet to come up with the answers to these fundamental questions?
It's obvious that this situation is one where Labour should be able to play a strong hand, and the Conservatives are playing a hand which is one they are unfamiliar with. Unlimited involvement in the economy, employing 1/3 of the UK payroll, which is what the government is doing at the moment, is something that no Conservative Prime Minister has ever imagined doing. So they're way out of their comfort zone. And we're already seeing a reaction to that. They are trying to end the furlough scheme too soon. By the look of it, they're panicking about the size of the national debt, when actually the national debt has gone down this year. Repeat that. The national debt has actually fallen in 2020 because the Bank of England has bought back more debt than has so far been created this year, which means that in real terms of what is owed back to the market, the national debt has fallen. And there is therefore an opportunity here for Labour to come up with something really creative. There's not a shadow of a doubt where that direction of policy should go. First of all, they should be looking at very long-term debt financing. Almost every sane macroeconomist that I know is now talking about issuing debt at tiny rates of interest. The government can pay 0.4% interest on debt of up to 50 years at present. That means effectively no interest throughout the lifetime of a loan. Issue that, or even issue it in perpetuity. Never, ever cancel the debt and never repay it. And there's a demand for debt of that sort. And you're in a situation where basically you can fund what's going on now without having to worry about a repayment. It's put off not just to our grandchildren's era. By the way, no grandchild has ever repaid the debt created by their grandparents in history. So we don't need to worry about that metaphor either. But it's literally put off to the point where we just don't have to worry about it. There is no issue about repaying debt at all. So he can fund whatever he wants. He can say he can deliver a Green New Deal. He can say he can commit to creating jobs in every constituency of the UK. And all of that is supported by business. There's not a question about that. Major business is all agreeing with what Labour should be saying. So there's a very, very clear platform out of this. So the Labour Party policy should be very clear. I just wish they'd start spelling that out because I believe people need to hear it.
So is there a sort of 1945 moment where the electorate might conclude post-pandemic that if these things were possible when fighting the pandemic, just as the electorate regarded what was possible in fighting the Second World War, then why aren't they possible in peacetime? Can this sort of existential crisis bring a fundamental transformation in public attitudes, and might that be to Labour's benefit?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that, Alex. I think that there is every chance that the public attitude is going to change. The fear of what is called debt, which is actually investment, will go. The idea that we're somehow in a desperate financial position because we're in fact spending to invest in our long-term future is going to cease to be a cause of concern. Remember that in 1945, the debt to national income ratio was 250%. And in real terms, at the present point of time, net of quantitative easing, it's only around 60%. So only a quarter of what it was then. And the idea that the government has got to fund its programmes with tax and balance the books, which has been promoted for a decade by the Conservatives as a way of putting forward the idea of small government, has again been shattered. The idea that everything has to balance and we can't borrow is gone. And I believe the time for politicians to not only ride that wave, but actually explain why it's appropriate to do so, and that this is the reality of the way in which the future can be funded, has arrived. And they need to actually explain that we really should now be talking about people investing through the government in our future. And the national debt in this sense is not anything to do with debt at all. It's the national credit, or better still, let's call it national savings and investment. And bizarrely, National Savings and Investment, which has 167 billion in it at the moment, is part of the national debt. It is just a saving scheme put to use to create a future for our country. And that's what the national debt is. If the Labour Party can communicate that this is the way to save for our future, then I believe that we have a real opportunity to transform society at large.
And finally, Professor Richard Murphy, talking of grasping the thistle, what will Keir Starmer's approach to Scotland be? And does have a chance of success?
Well, I think the first thing he probably needs to do is replace his leader in Scotland, although I'm sure that's something that the Scottish Labour Party has to address itself, but I hope they read the runes. If Labour was to grab the thistle, as you put it, and run with it and put forward a radical economic policy for Scotland, operating within a more devolved parliament, which I think Labour would be wise to consider. After all, it was the original promoter of, in 1997 of the Scottish Parliament devolving, and allowed that process to take place then. If it was to do that, I think Scotland would have a chance of recovery in Scotland and see more members return to London as a result. If it doesn't do that, its standing in Scotland at the moment is dire. I don't need to tell you that. I know how bad it is. I see Scotland as the future Saudi Arabia of Europe, because it has more opportunity for renewable energy than just about anybody else. So Scotland needs totally different thinking from England as far as Labour is concerned. Has it got the willpower, the energy, the insight to do that? I don't know. Certainly not under the current Scottish leadership.
Professor Richard Murphy, thank you for joining us again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex.
Many commentators thought that Sir Keir Starmer had drawn the ultimate short straw in becoming Labour leader under the shadow of the greatest health crisis for a century. In the event, the atmosphere of crisis has stood him in good stead, particularly in his forensic, understated style at Prime Minister's questions. The classicist Prime Minister has been shorn of the baying ranks of Tuscany by social distancing, and as a result has looked stumbling and inept. However, it'll take more than Boris's bumbling to make Keir Starmer Prime Minister. That will require squaring the European issue with Labour's former supporters and, above all, finding that new economic platform to take account of the post-pandemic reality. Over the last half-century or so, there have been two Labour leaders, Harold Wilson and Tony Blair, who've overturned large Tory majorities. For better or for worse, both of them caught the mood of the times. It remains to be seen whether Sir Keir Starmer can do likewise. And so from Tasmina, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe. We'll see you again next week.